This channel exists because people like you keep showing up. Subscribe and help us grow. A child's skeleton lay beneath the floor of a walled, moated city on the Mekong Delta for close to 2,000 years before anyone thought to ask what it was hiding. The bones belong to a boy, catalogued simply as Ab M40, buried at a place called Vat Komnu, part of the ancient settlement of Angkor Borei in what is now southern Cambodia. Radiocarbon dating puts his death somewhere between 78 and 234 CE, the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, long before temples, long before empires, long before most of the history books even begin their story of this region. Here is the number that should not exist. When geneticists sequenced this child's DNA, they found that 40 to 50% of his genome traces back not to Southeast Asia, but to South Asia, modern-day India, more than 3,000 kilometers to the west. Half of this boy, genetically speaking, comes from somewhere else entirely. That alone would be strange. What makes it stranger is the timing. Historians have long assumed that Indian ancestry entered mainland Southeast Asia slowly, centuries later, arriving with monks and merchants during the classical era of grand temple building. This child died before any of that. His bones predate the timeline by roughly 1,000 years. So before we go further, before we even name the people this child belonged to, the civilization whose descendants still speak the same family of languages today, sit with that question for a moment. If one child's bones came from 3,000 miles away, who really built the first cities on the Mekong? Before this discovery, there was a clean, tidy story, and for decades, nobody had reason to question it. The people of this region, farmers, fishers, city builders, and eventually kings, speak languages belonging to the Austroasiatic family, which includes Mon and Khmer, among dozens of other tongues. It is considered the oldest documented language family in mainland Southeast Asia, with roots reaching back to the Neolithic period. According to the Standard Model, the ancestors of these speakers did not originate where they live today. They migrated. Roughly 4,000 years ago, populations moved out of the central and southern Yangtze River region in what is now China, pushing south into mainland Southeast Asia. They didn't come empty-handed. They brought rice agriculture with them, and with rice came permanent settlements, and with permanent settlements came, eventually, cities. When these incoming farmers arrived, the land was not empty. It was home to a much older population, hunter-gatherers whose ancestry had split off from other East Asian lineages tens of thousands of years earlier, a genetic lineage archaeologists associate with the Hoabinhian tradition. The newcomers and the old inhabitants mixed. Genetically speaking, this is called admixture. Think of it less like a single stream of a river and more like 2 separate rivers merging into one, each still detectable if you test the water downstream. That merged signature, part incoming farmer, part deep local hunter-gatherer, became the genetic hallmark of Austroasiatic-speaking populations. It's a signature scientists have already found in ancient remains at Man Bach, Vietnam, dating to the Neolithic, and it persists, faint but traceable, in living populations today. The Emla and Hatin of Thailand, the Nicobares, and modern Khmer communities in Cambodia. That's the population side of the story. There's a second layer, a cultural one. For over 1,000 years, visitors to this region have marveled at how deeply Indian civilization shaped it. Sanskrit inscriptions carved into stone, Hindu and Buddhist iconography built into temple walls, entire systems of kingship borrowed from South Asian models. Historians have a name for this: Indianization. The framework, formalized by scholars like George Coedes in the mid-20th century, treats this influence as a cultural transplant. Ideas moved. Religions moved. Trade goods moved. But the assumption, largely unspoken, was that people, in any significant genetic sense, mostly did not. A handful of priests, a handful of traders maybe. Not enough to leave a mark in anyone's bloodline. And the city itself fits neatly into this picture. Angkor Borei, where our child was buried, was first occupied in the middle of the first millennium BCE. Walled, moated, positioned on the western edge of the Mekong Delta, it's considered one of the earliest urban sites in either Cambodia or Vietnam, part of Funan, one of the first organized states to emerge anywhere in mainland Southeast Asia. Local farmers, local hunter-gatherer descendants, a slow trickle of foreign ideas arriving by sea. That was the story. It works. It's coherent. It's the version taught in textbooks and cited in documentaries for a reason. It fits the archaeology, it fits the linguistics, it fits the inscriptions in stone. It works perfectly for reconstructing Southeast Asia's deep past. Until one particular grave gets reanalyzed. The child's bones had already been tested once before, and the first time around, nobody caught what was really there. In 2018, researcher Mark Lipson, working with geneticist David Reich's lab at Harvard, published the first genetic data recovered from AB-M40 as part of a broader survey of ancient Southeast Asian remains. But the sample was thin, extremely low coverage, just 0.047x on the standard 1240K SNP panel used for ancient DNA work. Barely enough to sketch an outline, let alone confirm a precise ancestry breakdown. The signal was there, it just wasn't strong enough to trust completely. Then, in 2022, a team led by Pia Changmai, working alongside Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna, along with Mark Pietraszewski, Miriam Stark, Rona Ikehara Quebrol, and David Reich, went back to the same remains. This time, they pushed the coverage higher, 0.061x, with variant calls at 64,103 sites on the same SNP panel. And what had been a faint signal in 2018 sharpened into something undeniable. A genuine, substantial South Asian admixture signal, confirmed. The number, restated with precision, 40 to 50% South Asian ancestry, not a trace, not a rounding error, nearly half. It is, as of this recording, the highest level of South Asian ancestry ever detected in an ancient Southeast Asian individual, and the first time this kind of ancestry had been confirmed in any pre-modern skeleton from mainland Southeast Asia at all. And the date makes it worse for the old model, not better. 78 to 234 CE. That places this child's South Asian ancestry a full millennium before the period historians had assumed deep genetic mixing began, the later Angkorian era, broadly the 9th through 15th centuries, not by a few decades, not by a lifetime, by centuries. Clean, expected, gone. The burial context makes this harder to wave away as a fluke. The Wat Khmer cemetery wasn't some isolated hamlet cut off from the wider world. The mortuary assemblage includes multiple pig skulls, imported beads, and ceramics, physical evidence of a community plugged into active exchange networks. This is a place people traveled to and through. The site itself was excavated between 1999 and 2000 by the Lower Mekong Archaeological Project, a joint effort between the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Cambodia's Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, and the Royal University of Fine Arts. Hardly an obscure dig, hardly disputed archaeology. Here is where it gets complicated. This isn't just some foreign ancestry turning up a little earlier than expected. This is a child, buried in an ordinary community cemetery, carrying that ancestry right around the founding moment of Funan, one of the very first states to exist anywhere in mainland Southeast Asia. Which means the old story, locals first, foreign trade contact added later, on top of an already formed Mon-Khmer world, may have the sequence backward. The foreign ancestry might not have been layered onto a finished civilization. It might have been present at the moment that civilization was being built. One explanation says this was simple trade contact. A trader passing through, a chance encounter, nothing structural. But researchers are careful to frame what they can and can't conclude from a single genome. What they can say with confidence is this: 40 to 50% ancestry in one child is a very hard number to explain with casual contact. So what actually happened here? The first theory says this was still fundamentally about trade, just trade at a scale and intimacy nobody had accounted for. It's the theory built directly on top of the old Indianization framework, and it has a serious problem. For most of the 20th century, historians treated Indian influence in mainland Southeast Asia as a cultural transplant, not a demographic one. Sanskrit inscriptions, Hindu and Buddhist temple architecture, entire systems of statecraft borrowed wholesale from South Asian models. All of it, according to this theory, arrived through maritime trade contact, a modest, steady flow of priests, traders, and officials, carrying ideas more than they carried descendants. Under this model, any Indian ancestry that turned up in the region should be minor, localized to a few trading ports. And critically, it should appear later, around or after the height of Funan and into the early Angkorian period, broadly the 5th century CE onward, once Indian religious and political systems had already taken root. AB-M40 breaks that timeline on both counts. His burial predates the expected window by centuries, and his ancestry proportion, 40 to 50%, is simply too high for a handful of visiting traders to produce in a single child. A trader passing through a port town, even one who stayed a season or two, does not typically leave that kind of genetic fingerprint on the next generation. The deeper limitation is this: The entire elite diffusion model was built almost exclusively on archaeological and textual evidence: carved stone, temple foundations, religious motifs. Before this study, there was no genetic evidence confirming that South Asian people, as opposed to South Asian ideas, had physically reached mainland Southeast Asia this early. Historians had been using cultural influence to infer genetic contact, without ever actually testing whether the two lined up. Cultural influence and genetic admixture are not the same thing, and for 100 years, nobody could prove they matched. One elite trader couldn't produce this number. If it wasn't a handful of visiting merchants passing through Angkor Borei on their way somewhere else, then something else was happening here. Something with more people, more generations, and a far more complicated explanation than anyone in Coedes's era ever accounted for. It wasn't one merchant passing through, it was a network, and it was older and deeper than anyone in Coedes's generation had accounted for. The second theory doesn't ask whether Indian traders visited Angkor Borei, it asks how many generations they stayed. Researchers have documented monsoon-driven maritime exchange routes crossing the Bay of Bengal as far back as the Iron Age, roughly 2,400 years ago, carrying far more than the occasional trader's cargo. These routes moved ironworking knowledge. They moved ornaments, religious systems, entire schools of thought. And under this model, they moved people, who stayed, who married, who raised children in the port towns they settled. Think of it less like a single ferry crossing a river once, and more like a bridge that stood in place for centuries, with traffic running both directions every season. Angkor Borei fits that role precisely. It wasn't a backwater outpost that happened to receive a stray visitor. It was a major early urban hub on the Mekong Delta, positioned, by geography alone, to receive exactly this kind of sustained contact rather than a handful of one-off visits. Under this theory, South Asian merchant and artisan families didn't pass through Southeast Asian ports. They settled inside them. They intermarried, generation after generation, with local communities descended from those Yangtze rice farmers and Hoabinhian hunter-gatherers we described earlier. And this isn't a theory built on one skeleton. A separate 2022 study, again led by Pia Chiangmai, this time published in PLOS Genetics, documented a broader pattern of Indian genetic heritage across Southeast Asian populations generally, suggesting AB-M40 isn't a freak result. He's a data point inside something larger and already structured. Here is where the ground shifts under Theory 1 completely. If this kind of admixture required generations of settled, intermarried communities, not a passing envoy, not a single priest with a retinue, then the clean, comforting version of the story doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The version where an indigenous Mon-Khmer civilization formed first, whole and complete, and only afterward absorbed some imported ideas from abroad. That version assumes foreign ancestry was added later, like a coat of paint over a finished wall. What this theory suggests instead is that the mixing was already in the bloodline near the very beginning, not layered on top of an already formed population, but present in its foundation. The third theory is the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, because it points in the opposite direction. Maybe this isn't a pattern at all. One child, one skeletal sample. That is, as of this recording, the entire evidentiary basis for the 40 to 50% figure that has anchored this entire investigation. Is AB-M40 representative of an entire community's ancestry, or is he the genetic fingerprint of one unusual family, caught by chance in a single burial? The original 2018 sequencing was so low coverage, 0.047x, that on its own, it would never have supported a claim this large. Even the improved 2022 analysis, for all its added precision, is still built from a single individual. One data point can suggest a pattern. It cannot prove one. There are other explanations that fit the same bones just as comfortably. Perhaps AB-M40 belonged to one internationally connected merchant family, unusually mobile and unusually intermarried compared to his neighbors buried in the same cemetery. An outlier, not a bellwether. Perhaps he wasn't a biological descendant of a mixed local lineage at all, but a child fostered or adopted into the community from elsewhere entirely, carrying ancestry that tells us nothing about the population around him. Researchers studying this case are careful to frame these possibilities as live alternatives, not dismissed ones. What would settle the question is straightforward in principle. More ancient genomes, recovered from the same cemetery, the same era, the same delta. As of this recording, those genomes do not yet exist in the published scientific record, so this stays open, not resolved in either direction, held, deliberately, in suspension. Picture the year 150 CE, standing inside the walls of Angkor Borei. The air sits heavy and wet off the Mekong Delta, the kind of humidity that never fully lifts, even at dawn. Around you, brick monuments are going up in stages. Foundations laid, walls rising, the moated perimeter of the city holding back the surrounding wetlands like a held breath. Twice a year, the monsoon winds shift, and with them come boats. Not local fishing craft, but vessels arriving from far across the Bay of Bengal, riding the same seasonal winds that archaeologists now trace as an established trade corridor reaching back centuries before this moment. Walk toward the canal system feeding into the delta, and you'd see them unloading, strings of beads, worked ceramics, goods that don't originate anywhere nearby. Nearer the Wat Khmer cemetery, mourners are burying their dead alongside multiple pig skulls and imported wares. Ritual and commerce laid into the same ground, inseparable from each other. Exactly as the excavation records from the Lower Mekong Archaeological Project describe finding them decades later. In the market square, you'd hear at least 3 kinds of people talking past one another in at least 3 languages. Descendants of the Yangtze rice farmers who arrived here 2,000 years earlier, descendants of the older hunter-gatherer population who were here long before that, and newly arrived traders from across the bay, some of whom would never leave. Somewhere in that crowd, generations before AB-40 was ever born, 2 family lines crossed paths that would eventually converge, centuries later, in the genome of one buried child. You wouldn't have seen it happening, nobody there would have called it history. It would have just looked like an ordinary market day. Here is where the story stops being about one child entirely. In 2025, a team of geneticists published the largest Austroasiatic genome-wide dataset ever assembled, drawing on populations across Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar. Living people, not ancient burials. And what they found complicates everything that came before it. Rather than uniform ancestry across the Austroasiatic-speaking world, the data reveals enormous genetic heterogeneity, with the greatest diversity of all concentrated among northern Mon-Khmer highland groups. Northern populations carry higher East Asian ancestry, tracing to Iron Age communities in northern Thailand and Cambodia. Southern populations carry that same East Asian and hunter-gatherer base, but layered with additional South Asian ancestry, echoing the same Neolithic-era connections found in ancient Laos and Vietnam, which means AB-40's signal was never an isolated anomaly. It's one visible thread in a pattern still written into the DNA of millions of living people today. Then comes the second twist, and this one cuts even deeper than the genetics. Researchers examining Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, the paternal and maternal lines passed down largely unchanged across generations, like 2 separate family ledgers kept in parallel, found that the Nyakar, a Mon-speaking population in Thailand, are genetically closer to the Khmer than to other Mon-speaking groups. Language says one thing, ancestry says another. Archaeological evidence from the Sri Thep site reinforces the same picture, tying Khmer and Dvaravati Mon populations together directly, on the ground, centuries before either group existed as the separate ethnicities we recognize today. Structured, not scattered, not random, which means the reframe isn't simply, there was more Indian ancestry than we thought. It's bigger than that. Mon and Khmer, labels treated for 100 years as 2 distinct peoples, 2 distinct histories, do not map cleanly onto 2 distinct genetic lineages at all. The real boundaries, the ones written in blood rather than in language, crisscross the linguistic ones entirely. Mon-Khmer was never one founding population waiting to be discovered. It's a label sitting on top of at least 3 deeply layered migration sources: ancient hunter-gatherers, Yangtze rice farmers, and South Asian traders turned settlers, blended unevenly, by geography, by trade winds, by choices made in market squares 2,000 years ago, by people who left no names behind, only bones and beads, and the DNA of children not yet born. One archaeologist working on Southeast Asian remains put it simply, in a moment researchers who study this region would likely recognize, you don't excavate a single origin, you excavate a series of arrivals, one on top of the last, and call the whole stack by one name, because it's easier than explaining the layers. That's not unique to Cambodia, or to the Mekong, or to any single language family. Nearly every ethnic and linguistic label in human history, when ancient DNA is finally applied to it, turns out to sit on top of multiple, unevenly blended populations rather than one clean point of origin. Identity, it turns out, is rarely a single thread. It's closer to a river delta itself. The very geography this story keeps returning to. Countless separate channels merging, splitting, and merging again, carrying sediment from a dozen different sources so thoroughly mixed that by the time the water reaches the sea, No one channel can claim to be the true one. Scientists scanned these ancient remains looking for a single origin story. What they found instead was a river with no single source. And the truth, still only partly surfaced, is only beginning to shock us.